Good evening, family. My YouTube family out there. Today I want to do this video and I want to talk about what I see as the differences between blacks in America and Africans. I want to touch on that. Very brief video, nothing too heavy. And I would also like to know your opinions down in the comment section. One of the things I've noticed with the differences that I've noticed between Africans and African Americans is phenotype. We look similar to one another, but there's distinct differences between the two as far as phenotype is concerned. I think African Americans have a very distinct look to them, and so do Africans, but it's different from one another on average. Also tend to think that blacks in America tend to be a bit more hairy than Africans. They grow mustaches and beards a lot quicker than Africans, though. I see a lot more bare-faced Africans that are naturally bare-faced than I do with so-called African Americans. Whereas African Americans, they tend to shave if they're bare-faced. A lot of Africans just tend not to really grow much facial hair. Not all of them, but a good number of them. Another big difference I see between Africans and African Americans is they don't have the superstars that so-called African Americans have. I have yet to see a African James Brown. I have yet to see an African Aretha Franklin. I've never seen an African Michael Jordan. I've never seen an African Muhammad Ali. But I'm basically saying is, I haven't seen Africans produce athletes and singers and dancers and talented people on the same scale as so-called African Americans. I don't want anyone to get offended, but I'm just stating my opinion. I think on average, white people play basketball better than Africans, but they don't box or play basketball better than so-called African Americans. I think I can put that in the category of a difference between us. Also, when it comes to inventions, there's also a huge gap between Africans and African Americans. African Americans have invented a lot of things in this country. Some of they didn't get credit for because, of course, when these things was written, they didn't have rights. So a lot of the inventions was stolen from them. But there's a book out there called 1001 Inventions of the Black Man. And you will see that damn near everything in this country, black people have invented or had a huge part in it being invented. And I don't really see the same with Africans. African Americans, they share a legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, where they were sold as chattel slaves, and Africans can't make that claim. They was actually selling the so-called African Americans into the chattel slavery. I just thought that was interesting, and I thought I'd just point those differences out. Not trying to be controversial, not trying to offend anyone. I just thought I'd point out those glaring differences between the two people because, they tend to look similar. And African Americans was living in West Africa before they was enslaved and sent to the Americas. That is true. But let's not ignore the differences that we have between us, those slight differences. And there's plenty of more differences. I can go into cultural differences, food and things like that, but I thought I'd just keep it on the surface. I have a question though for anyone out there watching or who disagrees. If Africa is a whole continent of so-called African Americans, why don't they have Muhammad Ali's and Mike Tyson's and Whitney Houston's and all the great musicians and singers and dancers and boxers that we have? Why don't they ever dominate the 100-meter races like a Carl Lewis or Usain Bolt? Just a question. Anyway, I'm gonna cut the video short at this point. Thank you guys for watching. God bless. Have a good day.